you're tired of bland supermarket tomatoes, it is time to try planting your own tomatoes. In that way you can choose older heirloom varieties which taste better. To get heirloom tomato seeds, you can try local South African suppliers like Living Seeds. As you experiment with heirloom tomatoes, you will realize that tomatoes are not all just red perfect spheres. In reality they vary in shape and size, from the tiny cherry tomatoes to beefsteak monster varieties, radically different from what the food industry portrays as tomatoes. They also vary in color, not all tomatoes are red. Now let's talk about planting tomatoes. First of all, you need to know that there are two main types of tomato, determinate and indeterminate tomatoes, because they take up different amounts of space. Determinate tomatoes grow to a limited, predetermined height. They tend to be bushy and usually grow up to 1 meter tall. This type produces their fruits in one go before dying away. Indeterminate tomatoes do not have a height predetermined by genetics. These types of tomatoes continue growing indefinitely until they are killed by cold or disease. Most tomatoes are indeterminate, Brandywine tomatoes being a specific example. Once you have decided on the type of tomato that you want, it's time to think about when to plant. In South Africa the best time to plant tomatoes depends on region, as temperatures vary widely. The best time to plant tomatoes in Cape Town is from around October. The best time to plant tomatoes in Durban is practically all year round, due to the warm temperatures. December is the only month where average temperatures may get a bit too hot, but would still be viable, if not ideal. The best time to plant tomatoes in Johannesburg is from August onwards. If you decide to plant them during cold seasons, it is advisable to start them in trays until they grow into seedlings, germination. Once the cold is gone, you can transplant the tomato seedlings onto your selected site. You should do this when the seedling stems are about 4 to 6 millimeters in diameter or 1 foot high. Choose the soil carefully. Check the soil composition and make sure the soil in your area is 15% to 35% clay content. In terms of pH, the optimum pH is 5 to 7, as tomatoes are fairly tolerant of acidity. Plant the seeds at a depth of 3 times the size of the seed. Tomatoes need ample spacing for maximum production and to minimize the spread of diseases and pests. Plant them at a spacing of 45 centimeters to 60 centimeters. An alternative to planting in a field or vegetable bed is to transplant your seedlings into pots. This gives you more portability as the seasons change, as you can easily move your tomatoes into the sunniest positions. For determinate tomatoes, the pot should be around 25 centimeters wide by 22 centimeters deep, in other words a pot of 46 liters assuming a cylindrical shape. For indeterminate tomatoes the pot should be at least 40 centimeters wide and 33 centimeters deep, in other words a pot of around 171 liters, again, assuming a cylindrical shape. Though this is the minimum, bigger is better in terms of tomato health. Not all tomatoes need support, but indeterminate tomatoes need strong support. One reason for this is that many insects are at ground level and supporting tomatoes so that they don't touch the ground helps to protect them. The simplest approach is a single stake in the ground, as shown in this picture, to which the tomato plant stem is tied. Begin tying your tomato plant to the stake after it reaches a height around 25 centimeters to 31 centimeters. As the plant grows you can add further ties every 20 centimeters or so. Sometimes 2 stakes are used, the double stake system. An alternative to staking is the cage. Just be aware though that the commercially available models tend to be too weak for larger tomato plants. Lastly there is the so-called Florida weave, where string is tied between 2 stakes. This can be repeated at different height, the idea being that the tomato plant can then weave its way up between the strings. Next up, you need to think about pruning. Pruning discourages growth but encourages more fruit bearing. It also increases the airflow rate, reducing the risks for pests and diseases infesting the plant. Pruning includes removing branches that are below the 6th or 5th branches by use of a thumbnail. Fertilizer is another consideration for maximum production. These veggies are nutrient hungry, therefore, they need to be fed heavily. You should enrich your soil before planting and feed them with organic potassium-rich fertilizer when they begin blooming. Top dress them with urea. Keep your tomato plants well hydrated, more so when they begin blooming. These veggies like having their roots watered. As you irrigate them, avoid overhead irrigation because it leads to pests and diseases. There are a variety of insects and birds that you need to protect your tomatoes from. You can do this in several ways. Using cages automatically affords some protection from insects, because it keeps the tomatoes off the ground. The next level up from this is to use a fence to keep larger animals away from the tomatoes. A further step is to enclose the tomatoes in a mesh that is fine enough to keep flying insects out. A greenhouse is another way to achieve the second and third options above. It stops larger animals as well as minimizing the number of insects. Planting herbs and other plants to repel pests. Some examples of plants you might consider are basil, oregano, marigolds, cabbage, chives, parsley, mint, geraniums and nasturtiums. Lastly, and perhaps one of the easiest, next to the cages, and affordable ways is using drawstring bags. You should tie the bags immediately after the fruit starts developing. Of course, smaller pests could always squeeze through openings around the bag opening, but it should keep the larger insects and perhaps birds at bay. As a last resort, you could consider pesticides. Commercial farmers use these, and GM crops are bred to resist even stronger pesticides that you wouldn't normally use. The problems with these pesticides range from effects on your health to damaging the microbes that break down minerals in the stones, rocks and soil to make them available to the plant. Yes, the soil isn't depleted of minerals like we are told, it is because poisons kill the microbes. Lastly, you need to plan in accordance with growth time. Tomatoes should take about 90 days to reach maturity.